Jack Carlson sat in the small cafe, playing with a spoon, twirling it around and around on the table. Finally, he said, "I've got this paper I have to write for a class on human behavior, and I have no idea where to start, or even what to write about. I was thinking about something related to gender, but I just don't know. Where do you even begin? Are there any references I can use? And honestly, what is gender?" Mark Townsend took a sip of the coffee in front of him and asked, "Who's your professor?" "Dr. Sharp. You know, look sharp with Sharp." Mark replied, "Oh yeah, Nancy had him a few years back." "Okay, but what kind of paper do you really want to write?" "What do you mean, what kind of paper?" "Well," Mark said, "you could just do the bare minimum and still get a decent grade. Or you could go all out, include footnotes, citations, a long bibliography, something that might really impress him, but you'd probably forget about it in a month. Or, and hear me out, you could write a paper that actually teaches you something. It might not be flashy, but who knows what you'll discover." "I think I'll go with that last option. After all, I came here to learn, not to impress." Mark smiled. "All right then. Can you meet me tonight at my apartment? I've got some appointments this afternoon, but I may have a few ideas to point you in the right direction. Say around 7? I live at 3649, Sycamore Terrace, Building C, top floor. I'll have some cold drinks ready, we'll talk it out. You remember how to get there, right?" Jack dropped his spoon in his cup and nodded. "Okay, sounds good." "Yeah, I think I do. Out Walker to Pine, left on Pine to the highway. I forget the number. Then a right at the second light. About a mile down, turn left at the next light. Your place is half a mile down, across from Fairwinds Shopping Center, right? Right on the nose. My building's all the way in the back on the left, third one. Oh, and bring a recorder. You'll probably want it." Mark stood up, turned back as he headed out, and said, "I'll get the check this time, you got the last." Jack knocked on Mark's door at 6:55 p.m. and was promptly greeted. "Hey, come on in, I'll grab you a drink." Jack entered the apartment and found a seat on the couch. He set up his recorder and did a quick test, stating time, date, location, and reason for visit. The apartment was simple: 2 chairs, a couch, coffee table, and several lamps. Along one wall were a few short but packed bookcases, each about 3 feet tall. Some books even sat on the floor. Jack got up and wandered around. "How many books do you have?" he asked. Mark returned with a drink and laughed. "I don't know. Every time I go out, the number seems to rise. Anyway, here's your drink. Grab a seat, let's talk." "Okay, I've got my recorder all set to go. First up, the gender issue. I think I'd like to explore that a bit," Jack began. "But where do I even start?" "Well, let's break it down," Mark said. "We're born biologically male or female, that's sex. But society has expectations that go beyond that. These expectations form what we call gender roles. You're seen as either masculine or feminine based on your behavior. For instance, girls are expected to play with dolls, boys with toy cars. But if a boy plays with dolls, he challenges those expectations. He's expressing himself outside of what's traditionally considered his gender role. Let's use a fun example. Imagine you, a guy, are walking down a road. There's a can on the ground and someone watching from a distance. In this society, let's say people associate kicking a can with feminine behavior. You think, why not, and give it a kick. The other person, seeing only the action, assumes you're female based on that behavior. But when they get closer, they realize you're male, and suddenly, they're confused. You didn't fit the mold. That's the power of gender norms. They shape how people are expected to act. So you're saying that when our gender expression doesn't match society's expectations based on our sex, we often don't feel like we fit in? Jack asked. And we might go to extreme lengths to belong, even changing ourselves physically? Jack took a sip of his drink, then continued. But societies change, don't they? So gender roles must change too. Mark nodded. Exactly. I think gender roles evolve as societies evolve. For instance, Housework used to be considered women's work, and factory jobs were for men. But during wartime, women worked in factories, and now it's common to see men helping with housework and women in all sorts of professions. So, yes, over time, society reshapes its boundaries. Your paper could explore how flexible or rigid those boundaries still are. Jack chuckled. I bet one of those boundaries is clothing. I can just imagine showing up to school in a skirt. Mark smiled. Funny enough, you're onto something. Historically, boys who misbehaved were sometimes made to wear girls' clothing as a form of discipline. The idea was that they'd have to behave sweetly and gently to avoid standing out. In a way, it forced them to adopt mannerisms they weren't used to, and in some cases, those behaviors stuck even after the punishment ended. They didn't quite fit in with the boys anymore, and they didn't fully belong with the girls either. It created a unique kind of identity, someone caught between expectations. He laughed lightly and added, in Scotland, for example, one form of punishment involved sending a boy to school in a kilt, but without the traditional sporran. Imagine you in that getup, Jack. Jack paused for a moment, then said, I think I understand. In order not to stand out, he had to suppress the traits people expect from boys and emphasize traits considered more feminine, like avoiding conflict, showing emotion, being gentle and polite. But how does that make someone stronger? Glad you asked, Mark replied. Let's bring religion into the mix for a moment. How does your professor feel about that? Dr. Sharp isn't especially religious. I think he goes to church once a month or so. Why? Because here's a topic you could explore, the relationship between spiritual traditions and gender expression. Jack blinked. That's definitely unexpected. Aren't those usually seen as being in conflict? I mean, doesn't some scripture say otherwise? You're probably thinking of a verse in Deuteronomy. I believe it's chapter 22. But let's step back a bit, way back, Mark said. Isn't this getting a little off track? Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. Maybe, Mark smiled. But hear me out. One ancient creation myth describes the beginning as pure chaos, then, out of chaos, came light and dark, life and death, male and female. And those opposites were each part of the other. When male and female came together, they became whole, and from that unity came humanity. Even today, some people view physical union as a symbolic return to that original oneness. In ancient cultures, Mark continued, men typically hunted, while women tended crops and raised families. Over time, women began observing patterns in nature, seasons, healing plants, birth cycles, and became associated with wisdom and creation. This gave rise to the worship of a female deity, a goddess figure, long before patriarchal systems took over. Okay, interesting, Jack nodded, but how does that relate to clothing? In some early spiritual traditions, Mark explained, only women could serve certain goddesses. So, for a man to participate in rituals, he would dress in traditionally feminine clothing, not to mock it, but to show reverence and align spiritually. This still exists in parts of the world today, where male shamans or spiritual leaders adopt feminine clothing in rituals honoring female energy. Mark paused to take a sip of his drink, then added, in many fertility festivals, that symbolism, the unity of male and female, still plays a central role. So it's not just about appearance, but about representing inner balance? Jack asked. Exactly, Mark said. There's a historical idea that men are strong, bold, protectors, and women are nurturing, gentle, intuitive. But real strength comes from recognizing we all carry both sides. If a man accepts his softer, more emotional side, rather than denying it, he becomes more whole. And stronger for it. Jack leaned back and smiled. So, it's about integration, embracing the full range of human traits, not limiting yourself. That's kind of like what marriage symbolizes, right? Two different forces becoming one. Right, Mark said. Each person accepting the other and balancing one another. You might even say, what the goddess has joined together. That might make a great title for the paper, Jack grinned. You know, Jack said with a spark of energy, this is actually getting interesting. I'm learning things I didn't know. So, we started with worship centered around a female deity, and over time, it shifted to a male-centered one. Instead of birth, something biologically tied to women, we now have symbolic themes of emergence from men. That sounds like a shift in emphasis, maybe even reducing the symbolic role of women. That's one theory, Mark replied. And now, some traditions include prohibitions around how men present themselves, such as not dressing in traditionally feminine ways. That could have been a way to separate the new religious practices from older spiritual customs. Like the older pagan practices you mentioned? Jack asked. Exactly. And here's something to think about. Look at the ceremonial clothing worn by many religious leaders. Robes, gowns, long flowing garments. You could say they resemble traditionally feminine clothing. Maybe the idea was to reflect balance, or to symbolically express a connection to a deity that transcends gender. Interesting, Jack said. And isn't there a passage that says God made man in his image? If we think of God as a being that's beyond male or female, maybe that means humanity was originally a blend of both, before being divided into male and female. Right. And that takes us back to the creation myth, chaos splitting into opposites, light and dark, male and female. Then they reunite through human connection, balance, and unity. Even the story of Eve being created from Adam's rib could symbolize equality, taken from his side, not above or below. That actually makes sense, Jack said, nodding. Last week in class, we were talking about gender expression. Someone said it might be a way for someone to reconnect with parts of themselves they usually keep hidden. Like when a man expresses himself through traditionally feminine clothing, it's not about fashion, it's about balance. He's not trying to become something else, he's trying to integrate who he is. Yes, Mark said. It can be an act of reconciliation. A return to wholeness. Some call it a paradox. In letting go of control or embracing softness, a person becomes stronger. Jack tilted his head. So, kind of like the idea that someone shows strength through humility? Exactly. Mark grinned. You win an award, and people admire you more if you accept it humbly rather than boast. Humility lifts you up, while arrogance pulls you down in others' eyes. So you're saying when someone embraces what society sees as lesser traits, like gentleness, emotion, softness, especially if they're male, they actually become more powerful for doing so? That's right. There's a saying, a man never stands taller than when he stoops to help a child. Same idea. Strength doesn't always look like dominance. Jack let out a breath. So gender, it really is a paradox. We're born with certain physical traits, but how we live them out depends on social expectations. And sometimes, society teaches us to suppress half of who we are. Exactly, Mark nodded. And it's not always about who you are, it's about how others expect you to act. Like if a boy throws a ball differently, someone might say, he throws like a girl, when really, he just learned from his older sisters. There's nothing wrong with that. But society labels it anyway. Yeah, I guess I get it, Jack said. But hold on, what about those things people often say are female traits, like being better at language, worse at math? Mark smiled. A lot of that has to do with how people are taught, what they're encouraged to do, and how the brain develops in response. There are scientific studies out there, but the key is, those generalizations don't define individuals. Fair enough, Jack replied. Let's get back to gender. So, if society stopped caring about what someone wore, whether they liked perfume or carried a doll to school, maybe the whole concept of gender would start to fade away. Exactly, said Mark. Imagine a world where a man could wear a dress and heels, have a beard, and nobody batted an eye. Where he could be soft and emotional and still be fully accepted. That's real integration, masculine and feminine in balance. That's real freedom. Jack groaned playfully. Now I've got brain wiring, gender roles, social expectations, and I thought this was going to be a simple paper. Mark laughed. You're talking about human beings, nothing simple about that. And when it comes to understanding masculinity and femininity, it gets even more layered. Biology, brain chemistry, environment, culture, they all mix together. A man in one society might express himself totally differently than the same man in another setting. People who express themselves through traditionally opposite gender clothing also relate to society in unique ways, especially when they're among others like themselves. Context changes everything. Jack shook his head with a grin. Thanks, Mark. Now that you've completely scrambled my brain, this thoroughly confused individual is going home to take a long nap. Just don't be too sure about that confused part, Mark said with a wink.